An artist like Eric Clapton, who was so influenced by the blues, and Led Zeppelin as well, understand the direct relationship between the blues and the music that they played, even as they evolved and developed and played rock music. That music became classic rock. The population of people who grew up with the music that was so blues infused, like Clapton's music, continue to live to this day. That's a reality. We're not getting rid of them. I like them. I'm one of them. But here's what that means. Classic rock radio realized that there was a group with spending power who were interested in the music, who would listen to their radio stations, and who would perpetuate and keep this music going as long as they possibly could. They would influence their kids. So you'll find that the kids of this particular age group are very much into this kind of music. Daniel, I know this has affected you as well, which explains exactly why you're doing this film in the first place. There is that strong influence. There isn't a kid who picks up a guitar or tries out those 3 chords on the piano at some point who isn't reflecting something that came from a generation before. Such a powerful culture. There are some people who don't like the fact that they're so powerful. They think that they've taken over everything, and everywhere you turn it's about stuff remembering the 60s and the 70s. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. We're talking about the foundation of popular music, and that direct relationship between the music and blues that was the foundation. How can that possibly be a bad thing? So whether it's Eric Clapton, Zeppelin, or Pink Floyd, these are the blues-based popular rock musicians who carried the music forward. They saw it evolve, of course, but you can find a direct line between the foundation of blues and the music that they became so popular for. This is my opinion with this. So I think psychedelic rock and its progression into what became progressive rock also has a lot to do with music and popular music entering the academies. So entering music training. You're moving away from musicians who were self-taught to musicians who had music education from universities and conservatories, who were learning about different genres, learned about blues, learned about jazz music, learned about different chord progressions, learned about classical music and how all of that could be infused. Fusion was one of these as well that happened even later on. I'm thinking about somebody like Pat Metheny, for example, for those of you guitar enthusiasts, bass guitar players, crazy about Jaco Pastorius. So you know about how this music progressed further on into things. So I think that here's what happened with that. It really has to do with the fact that music moved away from self-taught into being something that was taught in universities and academies, and then people brought that learning together and created a music that was carrying things even further. But if you pare it down and look at exactly what the elements are, there is a direct line that goes right back to the foundation of that music, which is the blues, and a direct line within that includes classic rock. There's a new band that's been announced recently that involves Carlos Santana. That's going to involve people like Wayne Shorter and Herbie Hancock. Imagine that. And that's mixing everything from the influences of Latino music styles and genres, Latino rock, some jazz, lots of blues elements in that as well. Folk music in Greenwich Village, in so many ways it has a stronger parallel even to the blues than the classic rock that evolved from the blues, in that it was a music that was immediately experienced by the audience. The folk musician often performed in smaller groups at coffee houses where the audience might have been just 2 or 3 feet away. Might have been call and response type music. It was a simpler structure as harmonically as music, where the music, although not taking a back seat to what was being expressed, was not always as important as what was being said. The music became completely married and fused with exactly what was being said. So you could express something with the music and then play a couple of refrains of the tune, and that would encourage the listener or excite the listener to also be involved at a sort of a soul level with what was being played with the music as you're sort of reflecting on what was being said. I also think that the folk music was a simpler way of getting messages across in it's kind of like a subversive, quiet way. It's like to me anyway, it's a kind of a subversion. I like it when you can gently nudge somebody into getting something done, or into changing something, or into an attitude or a way of thinking, instead of banging them over the head. You could find some of the foundations in modern day folk coming out of the Depression with singers who sang, those sort of singers who maybe rode the rails and sang about the hardships of going from town to town, trying to find work, trying to find food, not being respected, not able to find a room to stay in, trailer for sale or rent, right? What's that song? Folk music always had to do with giving people a chance to talk about the struggles and the challenges that they had with life. It was the closest music, like the blues, to what life was really like. Although you had a lot of folk music that was entertainment, folk music was more about expressing what was difficult and challenging in life. So people talked about trying to get a job. They talked about not having enough money to survive, or whether or not they would have enough money for their families. You hear those elements in blues, of course, but it was sort of a broader way of doing that. That's exactly the kind of music and sentiment that inspired the Washington Square movement near the end of the Second World War. The Beat Generation, man, that is about as challenging as talking about the hip-hop culture, because the Beat Generation was more than just the music. It involved lifestyle. It involved counterculture. May have been the earliest counterculture people who came through. It involved looking at expanding how you looked at the way you expressed yourself. So you found beat in types of spoken word. You found beat in poetry. You found beat in literature, the way you wrote things, the way you said things, the way that it was important for you to get your message across. And this also came along with music. You found that there were people who were saying, you know what, we're going to marry different types of art forms and we're going to put them together like multidisciplinary artwork.
And those people became the beatniks?
The people who were doing that kind of work were beatniks. When it actually happened that there were no beatniks and then suddenly there were beatniks, it's kind of hard to say exactly how that went along. Did beatniks become hippies? Not necessarily. Remember, beatniks were marrying all different types of genres, so folk music would have been just one of the music genres that influenced the people who became beatniks. Jazz was also massive at the time.
Sometimes you'll hear Metallica on classic rock radio. How do you feel about that?
I think there's always a bit of a challenge or a risk when you're trying to define classic rock by what you hear on the radio. Radio is dealing with demographics, certain different age groupings that are what help them to sell their product, which is the music. They don't exist unless there's some kind of revenue coming in for that. And if they're able to sell to a particular age group, then they can sell a certain type of music. If the age group likes the music that's being played, then they're going to be able to sell commercials for radio. Classic rock radio stations are also dealing with a sort of a popularity factor. And this is a kind of a confusing thing as well. Metallica, for example, is a band that has a huge following. This is a band that resonates really strongly with rock audiences. There is a strong connection to the blues foundation. At the same time, you're looking at heavy metal rock and roll as well. And there is a popular aspect to it. Whether or not it belongs in classic rock as a genre or classic rock as a radio demographic is going to be a challenging question. But what we do know is that it definitely resonates with its fans, and if music that's been around for a long time and continues to be around resonates with fans, then why can't we call that classic? It doesn't necessarily mean it's classic rock, but maybe you could call it classic. For classic rock enthusiasts, those who are purists about what classic rock actually is, that's the museum, and that's not a bad thing. It doesn't mean that it's dusty and old, and it's like a boring tour that maybe you went on when you were in primary school. But it is established, and it doesn't deviate from its definition. Whereas radio that's playing what it calls classic rock, or radio that brands itself as a classic rock station, is more like the gallery. They're dealing with popularity. It's a popular vote, really. It's who likes this the most? It's like grunge music, so people who love Nirvana, you'll hear Nirvana being played on classic rock radio stations, and you'll question that maybe. You'll say, well, I'm not so sure that this fits in exactly. I don't see how it's connected with some of the classic bands from long ago, the ones that would have been in the museums. But That's happening on on classic rock radio because you're dealing with demographics and what's popular and what the people in that demographic want to listen to. And if they're going to listen to that, it means that certain businesses will want to advertise on those radio stations, and everybody's happy in that mix. If you travel stateside or to some other countries, you have the difference between what's called an art gallery and an art museum. A museum to me is a place where you go and you can see the same things from history over and over again. They don't change what's on the walls or in the displays. It's very much established what was before. A gallery is a place where you're seeing art that is constantly changing or constantly in development. So I think the difference between an art gallery and a museum is that an art gallery can have different installations happening as cycles as it goes through different seasons, whereas a museum is going to have stuff that's there all the time. You go in, the dinosaurs don't change. We don't have brand new dinosaurs coming along, not that often. Every now and then they discover stuff, but maybe we should have a new dinosaur now. 30 to 50-year-old people represent a demographic in radio as a package, as an age spread. And this is an age group that grew up with bands like Metallica and Nirvana at the same time. Think about that, a 20-year age spread with people who were mixed in the type of music that they liked. At any other time, this would have been looked upon as a spread possibly too broad to even talk about as being a package. I mean, I'm a little outside of that personally. I'm on the top end of that. And I can remember a time when people were talking about don't trust anybody who's over 30, right? So if you're in the 30 to 50 age range, somebody who's 50 years old, I think you're looking at them as completely different from you as a person. But professionally, rock radio looks at that as an actual package. That's an age spread. And in that package, with classic rock, with exactly what we're talking about here, you have people who grew up with, look at these two bands, Metallica and Nirvana. Seemingly completely different things, but in the package, the same kind of music. The really cool thing about music is the fact that it has these elements that make it exciting to the listener and to the fan. The same reason that you hear heavy metal bands like Metallica on classic rock radio stations is the same reason you hear grunge bands like Nirvana on classic rock radio stations. It's the fact that they have this relevancy and that they mean so much to the fans. There is a resonance about the popularity of any type of music. And as it continues in its popularity as we move forward into the future, the nice thing about human beings is that we continue to grow and populate and produce and stuff. So we get really excited about the music that we like no matter what era it's from. And if we keep it alive, that's the kind of stuff on classic rock radio that prevents it from becoming oldies music. You heard me talking at one point about the idea of classic rock being something in a museum as opposed to something in a gallery. Museums are not a bad thing. If you want to talk about old music, classic rock music, that's museum stuff. You want to talk about classic rock radio and the progression of music as it goes along, doesn't matter who you're listening to. As I mentioned, whether it's Metallica or whether it's Nirvana or any of the grunge bands, that stuff remains relevant. So adding a band like Metallica or any of the bands from the grunge rock time basically keeps classic rock radio fresh and relevant for a large segment of the population. I'm in radio, so I'm not coming down on radio at all for what's being done, but understand that radio is a business and there are packages, demographics that radio needs to meet in order to sell commercial time, in order to stay in business and stay alive. This is almost like a sanctioned kind of fabrication of certain types of listening. And they're following popularity. There's nothing wrong with that. Popularity is what keeps human beings going and keeps us vital all the time. I'm just saying that a genre is, the difference between a genre and keeping a demographic happy is that the genre commands respect. The demographic is literally creating an area that kind of affects the feel-good sense inside of your soul. So it's a different kind of a thing completely. Different.
People still believe in the power of rock and roll music.
Hey, thanks for watching. My name is Daniel Sarkisian. I'm an independent filmmaker from Toronto.